Why did you sign up? I got an email from the school district here where we live, and I am prone to delete those fairly quickly because most of the time they're not relevant to me. But for some reason, the subject line caught my attention. And I don't recall exactly what it said, but it was something to the effect of worried about your son's screen time or your child's screen time or something like that. It happened to be at a time where we were ending a school year and going into the summer break. And we had a little bit of a challenge with our son in terms of finishing homework and um, being able to function. And so we were looking for solutions, and it just happened that this promotional email fell in our lap. And as I read it, it felt like it could really potentially apply to our son. We had noticed an increase in screen time, not just really in the recent past, but really throughout the last couple of years as the pandemic affected him and affected all of us. He was a student who had spent the first and worst year of COVID as a remote learner. He was still enrolled in a school district, but he was studying from home. And so there was a lot more screen time associated with classwork necessarily. And I think that was translating into an increased amount of screen time in his private time as well. So we had some concerns about all the time that was being spent on that device and the laptop or the laptop and the phone and whatever. It was just, it was a lot. It was a lot. And we saw some changes in him, probably affected by the pandemic as well. So we knew that there were pressures that were insulating and isolating to young people. And that had changed some of his behaviors and patterns in terms of how he might engage with the rest of the world. So it was just timely. It was a timely email that almost felt coincidental, but important. And so we jumped on it. I remember talking about it really quickly at the dinner table with Kirsten and our son. And we said, hey, let's give this a try. Let's submit an app.
What was your expectations going into the program?
It's hard to know what our expectations were in terms of outcomes because we really didn't have a full sense of how our son might connect with the material or connect with you all. But at least in terms of how it was presented, we thought there was potential there. I think the model that you all use to try to meet a student where they're at in digital space and spend a good portion of the session time with them without any sort of pressure to talk about themes or concepts, but to meet them and maybe have some fun. And to also, I think, protect their anonymity in some way. In other words, using avatar-based engagement and interactions and environments that are 3D, I think that was a pretty shrewd approach. It allowed them to, well, allowed our son, I can't speak for other youth, of course, but for him, I think it allowed him to have a mask of sorts and yet not trying to hide behind that mask, but allowing himself to be who he wanted to be without the pressure of being on a Zoom screen, so to speak, which has been their experience for much of the pandemic, right? If they were in a remote learning environment or situation, they had to constantly be on screen with their face. Our son was the type of student who wanted to dress that up with filters, or at one point had a green screen and he wanted to have a green screen so he could change his backdrop. I think the notion that you could meet in an environment that was familiar in terms of 3D landscapes, similar to the gaming experiences they might have had, I thought that was a great entry point for him. And then giving them the tools that they're familiar with, choosing an avatar, customizing that in some way. I thought it kind of reminds me of a Trojan horse approach. You're trying to get the material in, but you're allowing it to be wrapped up in this environment that is familiar to them. So I thought that was pretty shrewd on your all's part. But in terms of expectations, we really didn't know. We didn't know what would stick. We were ready for him to have a lackluster experience and to say, I don't want to do it again. So we were really pleased at the end of session 1 that he seemed to have had a good time. It was a small cohort. I'm not even sure if there was more than 1 or 2 people in the room with him, but he enjoyed it. And there was certainly no resistance to doing it again. And so that was a really encouraging sign. And we tried to stay out of his hair, and we tried not to meddle or be involved in that session in any way. We wanted him to be free to explore on his own and to make his own decisions about the fit. So we were really thrilled that he was certainly more than willing to do it again the following week. And that trend continued throughout the entire course. So whatever you all were doing obviously worked. You were able to probably have some fun. And I could hear laughter coming from his bedroom as though he was having a good time. But obviously, then you were able to talk curriculum as well and give him some stuff that hopefully helps him in the future.
Did anything change in terms of behavior that you can notice?
This is obviously very timely since we just talked earlier this morning. I changed locations, right? So I came to my work office. Before I left, I peeked my head at my son's door and I just said, "Hey, I'm heading off to work. How's it going?" And we had a little dialogue because he and his mom are about to go off on a kind of day and a half adventure to a water park, kind of a last fling before school starts next week. And they're excited about it. He's excited about it because he's been kind of looking forward to doing a theme park thing all summer long. So this is one of his loves. He loves to swim. He loves to be in the water. And this is a chance for him to be in a theme park and also go to a place where there's a lot of water. So unprompted, he says to me, "And guess what? I won't have access to a computer for 2 days." And he pointed over to his laptop with a smile on his face. I said, "Yeah, I think you'll probably do all right, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll do fine. I'm gonna be having fun." So I think just the timing of that was ironic since we had just been talking earlier this morning about whether it sticks or not. The long term is what we're going to be trying to work on. Can we get these lessons to stick? Can we remind him of the right vocabulary, the right concepts, the right themes, and get him thinking about his relationship with a device versus the relationship with the real world? And I think that's showing promise right now. I think it's showing promise that is going to stick and that we can return to those conversations.
Love to shift gears and talk about the parent guidance piece.
Yep.
Halfway through the program, we rolled this out. Why did you sign up in the first place?
It didn't take long for me to start thinking about what is my relationship to my devices and what are all of our relationships to our devices, let's say in our nuclear family. And is that something that needs my attention as well? So when the offer was made to also have some sessions for me, obviously a much different age demographic and a different kind of focus, I said, "Hey, this is important. I should tackle this." I learned a ton about my habitual use of my devices. Christian was really good about unlocking some tools for me in terms of just assessing and monitoring the way in which I use a device. So I've known these tools existed, whether it be in iOS or Mac OS and the integration of those two. But I've never really wanted or thought to say, let me gaze at my own self and see how I use a device. So I learned a lot. And I'd already had an inclination to think that maybe some of the ways in which I was using a device was preventing me from being as productive or even as happy as I'd like to be. There's a lot of things in the world right now that I think can suck us down into a place where we're less than happy or less than satisfied. So I learned a lot. And I think most of those habits I've been able to modify and moderate and think about whether or not I really want to engage with a device in that way. Some of that might be quantity. How much time do I spend and what's the opportunity cost for all of that? Some of it might be putting limits on certain applications and saying, what's a reasonable amount of time to spend within a certain environment or a certain application? And how is that affecting my own personal relationships? If I value those personal relationships, I might need to make some changes. So I think what I learned after a couple of weeks of going through those sessions is that it was as much on me to reflect upon these things as it is for my 13-year-old son to reflect upon it. If I want to have a strong positive relationship with him or other family members or friends and colleagues, I need to maximize the amount of time that I have for those people. And in some ways, it's a wellness issue. It's not unlike being out of shape and thinking about, do I need to make some changes in exercise or diet or whatever it might be? In some ways, that's how it started to feel to me. It's a digital wellness approach. And let's face it, I think all of us need to think about this. This is a pervasive and ubiquitous thing, and we're all dealing with technology in ways that are still, in many ways, unprecedented. We are still learning how technology is impacting us. And we're only a couple of decades into that experiment. That's a very short amount of time in human history. And the trend lines, of course, suggest that it's only going to get more and more immersive, more and more real feeling. If we're in a 3D metaverse early stages right now, what is that going to look like 20 years from now? Sci-fi has predicted that, and sci-fi does a fun job of exploring that. As a storyteller, I enjoy those things, but I'm also a little bit petrified by all of that and how maybe forces beyond my control could manipulate me as a human being and change who I want to be. So, well, it's something as simple as advertising and how advertising is marketed to us, or information and news, disinformation, misinformation. All of this stuff I think is important for every human to wrestle with. So I know that the core demographic is that young person who's trying to figure out the balance between digital reality and real reality. But I also think that it's ageless in terms of how we need to be approaching this stuff. So I was excited to be a part of that conversation. And I know that it stuck with me. Now, not everything's going to probably have the shelf life that I thought it would. I've already made some changes where I said, you know what? It's not that bad. Let me go back to this one app that I had deleted or minimized. But I think I'm approaching it at a much different mindset where I have some limits placed on that, some time limits each day, or what's reasonable, what is healthy. That's been an exciting epiphany for me. I think it's only fair that if I'm asking my child to do something, that I be willing to do it myself. Now, maybe the focus would be a little bit different. I didn't meet up with you all in virtual space and put an avatar on. We were meeting as humans face to face and exploring my habits, and suggestions were being made in terms of how I could potentially use technology to help me minimize the negative impact of that. So in some ways, that's a willingness thing. I have to be willing to do what I ask my own kid to do. And it was a time of year where I felt I could do that. So for me, at least, the summertime worked really well. I'm an educator. I had some time. I could commit to this without feeling like some other part of my work life was being impacted, or that I was being distracted from what I needed to do as an educator. When you mentioned why I would want to do this, why I would want to reflect upon my own technology use, you mentioned obviously my family. I mentioned the importance of those relationships. But I also think as a teacher, I think about my responsibility to my own students as well. And they get a lot of my time. They get a lot of my attention. And if I'm incredibly efficient with how I use my time with them, I also have to be efficient and hopefully as productive as possible with my own family or my friends, because there's only so much time in the day. And if I'm spending too much time worrying about what's trending on Twitter, something's got to give, right? Some population that I care about is going to suffer, whether it be work or family. And that balance is too important to me not to reflect and potentially make changes if I need to make changes. I'm old enough that a big chunk of my life was led before digital technology. So I have some context for what it should be like in terms of effective relationships and real relationships. So I think maybe it's me returning to a balance that I already know and understand, unlike maybe that 13-year-old who has to figure out the balance because they've grown up with technology their whole life. But it's still as addictive if you're not careful. I think the digital technology, whether it be a phone or whatever, can immediately become addictive to you if there's something entertaining, or if it provides a dopamine rush or whatever it is. We've got to be able to identify that as a habit that's potentially unhealthy. And there's a lot of reasons why I felt like I should engage. And thankfully, it was a time of my normal cycle of work that I could engage and really take some time to think about that stuff.
What would you say to other parents who find themselves in similar situations, who may be struggling with this? What would you say?
I think the process has been very helpful to me, and I would certainly encourage other people to give it a chance. Probably the thing that I would suggest to parents, we are a very skeptical society these days in terms of anything that comes packaged as something that could solve a problem. We have been saturated with marketing and advertising for so long that I think there's a natural skepticism to anything that sounds new. And one of the things that I would say that I think I've discovered through working with you all, my initial skepticism or concern about, is this going to be effective for my child? Is this going to be effective for me? That skepticism was pretty quickly eliminated because I came to believe in your mission and your purpose, what you were trying to accomplish. And as I've told you before, Becco, I have been very impressed with the way in which you've dealt with the personal relationships that you're developing with your clients. You all have spent a great deal of time and care, whether it be with my son or with me. And I think that's been really valuable because let's face it, that's human. We've come to know each other as humans a little bit. And that's one of your core objectives is to help us remember that we are humans in real relationships and in a real world. And that's not to diminish the potential power of meeting somebody in virtual space and saying you're human too, even though you're behind an avatar. My son has made a friend with a person in Florida, and they seem to get along quite well behind their avatars. That's real too, even though it was virtual. Because if you're stuck in a quarantine or if you're stuck in your bedroom, there's still great value in those social relationships that you can make in digital space. So I'm not a Luddite or somebody who's antagonistic about technology. I actually think it can be used in a very strong and brilliant way. But let's face it, we've got to always monitor it and we've got to be balanced about it. You've helped us think about that in a positive way.